The village of Oak Haven did not so much exist as it did settle. It was a place that had found its final shape centuries ago and had since been engaged in the quiet, perpetual act of holding that shape. It sat in a gentle basin of rolling hills, a clutch of gray stone and dark timbered roofs gathered around a church with a steeple that pointed not so much to heaven as to the enduring, unchanging center of things. The river that gave the valley its life was a slow brown muscle, flexing only with the seasons, its murmur a constant low-frequency hum beneath the village's other sounds. This was the stillness, not an absence of sound, but a presence of depth. It was the creak of an ancient signboard in a rare breeze, the distant conversational lowing of cattle, the rustle of 100-year-old oak's leaves discussing their own longevity. It was the weight of time made audible, a sound so constant you had to learn to hear it by unlearning the noise of the world beyond the hills. In a cottage that leaned companionably against the churchyard wall lived the man who was less a keeper of time than its most attentive listener. Silas Erlingen was a clockmaker, though his workshop held more than clocks. It was a museum of measured moments, sundials with eroded numerals, hourglasses with sand the color of old bone, water clocks whose dripping was a meditation, and a vast, beautiful, and perpetually broken marine chronometer that had once charted courses across oceans. His own clocks, however, were the heart of the place. They were not all correct, nor were they all meant to be. One tall case clock, its walnut case black with age, kept a time all its own, chiming the half hour at the quarter and the quarter at the half. Silas called it the philosopher. Another, a simple wall clock with a painted Roman numeral face, had not been wound in 20 years. Its hands were frozen at 3:10. "That's the moment my father stopped," Silas would say if asked, his voice as soft and worn as the velvet on a clock's pendulum bob. Not the moment he died, the moment he truly arrived here. He was always a man of 3:10. Silas's own time was marked by the slow, deliberate rituals of his craft. Each morning he would open his shop, not with a jingle of a bell, but with the soft, sighing groan of the old hinge. He would light a single lamp against the perpetual dusk of his workshop, its flame dancing on brass gears and polished oak. The air smelled of oil, old wood, dust, and the faint, sweet metallic scent of brass. His work was not about forcing time to obey, but about persuading it. A stuck mainspring was not a problem to be conquered, but a tense muscle to be soothed. A warped pendulum was a dancer who had lost its rhythm, to be gently rebalanced. He worked with the patience of a gardener, understanding that the mechanisms he tended were living histories of stress, friction, and quiet resilience. The village's history did not move in the frantic leaps and bounds of textbooks. It seeped. It was in the way the church's stonework was worn smooth by countless leaning backs, not in a single dramatic event. It was in the recipe for Mrs. Gable's gingerbread, which had changed subtly with each generation, a teaspoon less molasses here, a pinch more cinnamon there, a slow evolution of taste. It was in the field beyond the mill, where the ridge and furrow of medieval plowing could still be seen in a certain light, a ghostly fingerprint of an older, slower agriculture. History here was sedimentary. Each layer, the Roman pottery shard, the Saxon burial mound, the Tudor hearth, the Victorian schoolhouse, was not buried, but present, pressing gently against the present, giving it weight and context. To live in Oak Haven was to live on a palimpsest, where the past was not erased, but merely allowed to fade, like an old watermark. Silas understood this better than anyone. His great-grandfather had built the philosopher clock. His grandfather had repaired the village's public clock after the Great Gale of 1897. His mother had taught him that the true sound of a clock was not the chime, but the silence between the chimes, that pregnant pause where expectation lived and time was felt, not heard. The story, she'd say, winding her own favorite timepiece, is always in the stillness before the next word. The stillness before the story begins, that was the heart of it, the moment of potential, of suspended breath, the calm evening settling in, not as an end, but as a necessary preface to the night's dreams. This delicate equilibrium, this centuries-long exhale, was first disturbed by a rumor carried on a rare brisk wind from the south. A man from the city, a developer, had bought the old fallow field by the river, the one with the ghostly plow marks. He had plans, big plans, a heritage experience center with a zip line, a craft beer hall, and a chrono theater that would use immersive technology to tell the vibrant story of Oakhaven. The word vibrant felt like a violation in the village's quiet vocabulary. Vibrant was what a bruise was. Vibrant was a shout. The news seeped through the village like a stain. It was discussed not in angry crowds, but in hushed fragments over garden fences, in the extra-long pause at the pub. Mrs. Gable worried the zip line would scare her chickens. Old Tom at the mill fretted about increased traffic on the narrow lane. The vicar, a kind man, more versed in grace than zoning laws, wrung his hands, seeing the sacredness of the landscape as a text to be annotated with neon signs. Silas said nothing. He listened. He listened to the new, sharper note of anxiety that had entered the village's hum. He watched the way people's eyes flickered towards the field, now a canvas for a future they didn't want to imagine. The stillness had developed a tremor. The developer, a man named Leo Vance, arrived on a Tuesday. He drove a car so new and silent it seemed to absorb sound rather than make it. He was all sharp angles and efficient movements, a creature of the world of before and after, with no time for the endless looping during. He walked the field with a man from the council and a woman with a rolled-up blueprint, their gestures broad and decisive, carving the air into parcels of profit and experience.
Silas watched from his workshop window, his hands resting on the cool glass of a carriage clock he was cleaning. He saw Vance point to the ancient oak at the field's edge, the one his mother had called the storyteller for the way its roots drank from the old burial ground. He saw the woman shake her head, presumably at the tree's unsightly presence. The gesture was small, but in the cathedral of stillness that was Oakhaven, it was a thunderclap. That evening, Silas did not wind his clocks. He let the philosopher's erratic chiming fall silent. He let the frozen 3:10 remain in its timeless state. He walked, not to the field, but to the churchyard. He sat on the low, lichen-spotted wall beneath the yew tree that had witnessed 1,000 burials and 1,000 births. The dusk was settling, exactly as it always had, with a soft, impartial grace. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. The silence here was different from his workshops. The workshop's silence was curated, a tool. This was a silence of being. It was the village's soul exhaling. He thought of his mother's words. The story is in the stillness before the next word. Vance and his plans were the next word, a loud, brash, commercial word. But the story, the true, deep story of Oakhaven, was not in the word itself. It was in the breath that preceded it. It was in the accumulated weight of all the breaths that had come before. The story was the slow seep of history, the patient erosion of stone, the generational shift in a recipe, the memory held in the grain of a wooden beam. It was the silence between the events, the space where meaning rooted and grew. The next day, Silas did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He opened the great locked cabinet in the deepest corner of his workshop. Inside, nestled in beds of faded velvet, were not tools, but artifacts. A Neolithic flint arrowhead, smooth as a worry stone. A medieval lead spindle whorl, worn thin by a thumb that had turned to dust. A tiny, exquisitely painted wooden figure of a saint, its face serene, from a destroyed abbey. These were not his inventions, they were his inheritances. Each was a perfect silent vessel of a moment utterly still. They had been found, not excavated, arrived, not discovered. They were gifts from the earth, from the slow, generous work of time revealing its own layers. He took the spindle whorl. It fit perfectly in his palm, a cool, dense circle of history. It had not been made to tell a story, it had been made to spin thread. Its story was one of use, of rhythm, of a woman's hand turning wool into warmth, day after day, year after year. That was its narrative, not an event, but a process, not a word, but a continuous verb. An idea, fragile as a spider's web, began to form in the stillness of his mind. It was not a plan to fight Vance with his own tools, lawsuits, protests, noise. That would be to play his game, to enter the world of frantic before and after. No, the only way to defend the stillness was to deepen it, to make it so palpable, so present, that the loud word would have nothing to land on. It would be a shout in a cathedral, absorbed and dissipated by the sacred air. He began to work, but not on clocks. He began to gather. He went to Mrs. Gable and asked for the original, handwritten recipe for her gingerbread, the one her great-grandmother had copied from a neighbor. He went to old Tom and asked to see the old mill's account book, its pages filled with a spidery script recording deliveries of grain and flour in measures no longer used. He spent a day with the vicar, not in the church, but in the overgrown patch behind it, where the vicar's predecessor, a botanist, had planted every native wildflower mentioned in parish records from 1750. They were still there, fighting a quiet, beautiful war against bramble and nettle. He did not explain, he simply asked with a quiet intensity that brooked no refusal. He was collecting the still moments, the processes, the slow verbs. He was gathering the between. Meanwhile, Vance's plans became more concrete, more public. A glossy brochure appeared in the pub. It showed a vibrant, digitally rendered chrono-theater erupting from the field, with people laughing on the zip line. It called Oakhaven a hidden gem waiting for its moment. The phrase stuck in the village's craw. They were not a hidden gem, they were a settled stone. There was a difference. A gem was meant to be found, polished, displayed. A stone was meant to be sat upon, built with, to mark a boundary or a grave. The tremor in the village's stillness grew. There were meetings, there were arguments, low and tense in the pub. There was a petition, which most signed with a heavy heart, feeling the act of signing a piece of paper was already a concession to Vance's world of documented intent. The stillness was being strained, pulled taut like a drumskin.
Silas finished his gathering. He had not built anything. He had not written a manifesto. He had simply collected the village's breath, its pauses, its slow, deep rhythms. He had a box. A simple, unadorned oak box made from a plank of wood salvaged from the vicar's old shed. Inside, nestled in soft wool, were the things he had gathered: the recipe, the account book pages, the pressed flowers, the spindle whorl, a shard of pottery with a thumbprint still visible in the clay, a page from the church warden's log describing the slow repair of the roof after the 1897 gale, a repair that took 3 years, done as the weather and funds allowed. He also added something of his own. He took the simple frozen wall clock from his workshop, the one at 3:10. With infinite care, he did not move its hands. Instead, he opened the back
and using a fine drill made a tiny, precise hole through the face, right at the numeral 3. Then he threaded a single, impossibly fine strand of black silk through it, knotting it securely on the back. The silk hung down, a single silent thread, a pendulum of nothing, a marker of that frozen moment. It was the stillness made visible, the breath before the chime that would never come again. The day of the council's final decision arrived. The meeting was to be held in the village hall, a drafty, utilitarian room that felt like a betrayal of the village's organic soul. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Vance was there, sleek and confident, flanked by his architect and a smooth-talking consultant. They spoke of jobs, of progress, of activating the heritage asset. The words were like pebbles thrown into the deep well of the village's silence, and the echoes were ugly. When it was the villagers' turn to speak, their voices were hesitant, fragmented. They talked about views, about traffic, about the oak tree. They were trying to articulate the value of the stillness in the language of the world that wanted to destroy it. It was like trying to describe the color blue to a blind man using only spreadsheets. They were failing. Then Silas stood. He did not approach the podium. He simply walked to the center of the room, where a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh, unforgiving light. He placed his simple oak box on a small table. "You speak of a story," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the still room. "A vibrant story. You have your words, your zip lines and theaters and experiences." He gestured to Vance's glossy plans, laid out on another table. "But you have missed the first and most important part of any story." He opened the box. The soft wool inside seemed to absorb the harsh light. He began to take things out, not with ceremony, but with the care of a man handling relics. "This," he said, holding the gingerbread recipe, "is not a story. It is a process. It is the story of 100 winters, 100 harvests of ginger and molasses, 100 adjustments to a fire's heat. It is the story of a family's taste, slowly changing, like a river finding a new course. It has no beginning and no end. It simply is." He held up the mill's account book page. "This is not a story. It is a record. It is the slow, patient accounting of grain and flour, of seasons good and bad, of trust and debt. It is the story of sustenance, measured in bushels and shillings, not in thrills." He placed the spindle whorl in the light. "This is not a story. It is a tool. It is the story of turning, of twist, of making. It is the rhythm of a woman's hand, a rhythm that matched the turning of the seasons, the growth of the sheep, the needs of her family. Its story is in the where, not in any event." He held up the silk pendulum from his clock. "This is not a story. This is a stillness. This is the moment that holds all other moments, the breath before the word, the pause that gives the note its meaning. You cannot put a price on this. You cannot build a theater for it. You cannot sell a ticket to it. You can only be in it. You can only let it be." He looked at Vance, then at the council members, his gaze steady. "You want to tell our story. You cannot, because you do not speak its language. Its language is not English. It is the language of slow growth, of patient wear, of processes that span generations. It is the language of this soil." He tapped the box. "What is in this box is not Oak Haven's history. It is Oak Haven. The field you want to dig up is not a heritage asset. It is a page in a book that has been writing itself for 10,000 years. To put a zip line on it is to scribble a graffiti over a manuscript written in earth and bone." He closed the box. The click of the lid was soft, final. "You cannot activate what is already fully, completely, and eternally active. You cannot bring to life what has never been dead.
You are standing in the middle of a living story, and you are trying to sell the silence between the words as if it were empty space. It is not empty. It is full. It is everything.